Hello, good evening. Well, I guess it's morning at this point. Good morning. I've been doing a Rockford reading, but before I get into actually reading, I do want to say, let me know how the audio sounds. I checked a little bit earlier on today, and it sounded good, but I don't know. And subscribe to the newsletter, subscribe to our podcast, Spotify, Anchor, Apple Podcasts. Apple Music and Apple Podcasts is not the same thing. You gotta get the actual podcast app, and it'll be should be on there. I'm be reading People's History of the United States. It's a book by Howard Zinn, and it was recommended to me. I'd say maybe midway through the so far into the occupation, and I read a good portion of it, maybe a third of it, and I really liked it. It was a lot of education, a lot of learning, a lot of things that I never learned in school, that I was never taught, or anything at all. So it was really insightful. Really learn more about history and the true history, not a history that is filled with bias, not a history that is trying to convince you that this side won, but a true, unbiased, unfiltered history. So first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna read the table of contents just to give you guys kind of a overview of what this book covers. Chapter 1, and I think part of the reason I wanted to read this book is because really I wanted to finish it, and I also wanted to, I think it's topical. The first thing it covers is Columbus and the Native Americans and the indigenous people. So I think it's topical, it's educational, and it's important to learn about these things. So the first thing to cover, Chapter 1, Columbus, the Indians, and Human Progress. Chapter 2 is Drawing the Color Line. Chapter 3 is Persons of Mean and Vile Condition. Chapter 4 is Tyranny is Tyranny. Chapter 5, A Kind of Revolution. 6, The Intimately Oppressed. 7, As Long as Grass Grows, Our Water Runs. 8, We Take Nothing by Conquest, Thank God. Chapter 9, Slavery Without Submission, Emancipation Without Freedom. Chapter 10, The Other Civil War. That's where I stopped reading. I don't believe I made it to Chapter 11. Chapter 11 is titled Robber, Barons, and Rebels. 12, The Emperor and the People. Chapter 13, The Socialist Challenge. Chapter 14, War is the Health of the State. 15, Self-Help in Hard Times. 16, A People's War. 17, Or Does It Explode? Or Does It Explode? 18, The Impossible Victory, Vietnam. 19, Surprises. 20, The 70s, Under Control. 21, Carter, Reagan, and Bush, The Bipartisan Consensus. 22, The Unreported Resistance. 23, The Coming Revolt of the Guards. 24, The Clinton Presidency. And 25, the 2000 election and the War on Terror. So really it's quite an extensive book, and it go through a large time period. Introduction to the 35th anniversary edition of A People's History of the United States. Howard Zinn fundamentally changed the way millions of people think about history with A People's History of the United States. He would be the first to say, however, that he didn't do so alone. The book grew out of his awareness of the importance of social movements throughout U.S. history, some of which he played an active role in during the 1960s and 1970s and beyond, namely the Civil Rights Movement, mass mobilizations to end the Civil War, as well as other anti-war movements, and the many movements for higher wages and workers' rights and the rights of women, Latinos, Native Americans, gay and lesbians, and others. He was also quick to acknowledge the many people who informed his view of history. Woody Guthrie, whose songs about working people in the 1930s and 1940s opened up chapters of U.S. history to him that his formal education had kept hidden. Philip S. Foner, Herbert Aptheker, Richard Hofstadter, Elizabeth Martinez, and other writers, editors, librarians, and historians who unearth what he calls the past fugitive movement of compassion rather than its solid centuries of warfare. But most of all, he acknowledged people whose stories he weaves throughout the book. Eugene Debs, Fannie Lou Hamer, Frederick Douglass, I believe it's Plow Jogger. I apologize if I get any of these names right. If you know the correct pronunciation, comment below and I'll read it. Howard understood that he was writing to bring their voices and stories, their struggles and vision to light, and inspire people to make changes themselves. That is why he was so keen to publish a companion book to this volume, Voices of a People's History of the United States, which compiles the speeches, letters, manifestos, and other documents of people's history that he drew on to write a people's history, this book. And to also remind people that this history continues in new forms today. And it is why he wanted to make this documentary film, The People Speak, with artists such as Bob Dylan, Kerry Washington, Viggo Mortensen, and Danny Glover, to bring these voices vividly to life. He understood that his own words in this book, my fault, the pages stuck together. Dang. Hold on. He understood that his own words in this book, as meaningful as they were less vital to the success of a people's history than the words and actions of others he wove together. Hold on, give me 1 second. Okay. There we go. Howard was uniquely skilled as a writer, as this book reveals. Millions of people have read this book, a remarkable achievement for any work of popular history, and passed along their dog-eared copies to friends, family members, fellow soldiers, and co-workers because it opened up new horizons for them. Of those readers, many went on to become teachers as a result. Many more felt the book had changed their lives and sent them down new paths. I'm one of them. Reading this book and later having the great luck to meet and work with Howard radically changed me. It made me care about history as no other teacher or experience had done. And it led me to see history as something that we are all part of making together, and to realize that how we understand our past informs not only how we see the present with all its complexity, but also how we might imagine a different future. When A People's History of the United States came out in 1980, its first print run was a few thousand hardcover copies. Considered modest for HarperCollins, but it soon found an audience excited to read a book that provided such a comprehensive and artful bottom-up view of U.S. history. In contrast to the still dominant tropes of great white men and the occasional great in contrast to the still dominant tropes of great white men and the occasional exceptional others who made history an especially disempowering view. The civil rights leader Diane Nash, whom Howard knew through his work with the Student Nonviolent from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, recently commented on how hard it has been for our culture to embrace histories that feature the efforts of ordinary people whose name we may not even know or rarely learn from our textbooks. Discussing the critics of 2014 film Selma, who said it unfairly diminished the role of President Lyndon Baines Johnson in bringing about civil rights legislation, an argument with which Howard was extremely familiar, she responded, okay. Hold on, give me 1 second. Let me grab water real quick. Okay. She responded, Lyndon Johnson was president. It was his job to enforce the law. He should not have waited until Jimmy Lee Jackson's, James Reeves, and Viola Louiso's lives were taken. He should not have waited until people were beaten and bloodied on Pettus Street before he enforced Africans' right to vote in the South. I appreciate LBJ's enacting and signing the Voting Rights Act, but I wish he had been a self-starter when it came to our right to vote, so it would not have been necessary to go to the lengths that we did, organizing a mass movement and risking our safety in order to get the vote. It was the courage, work, thoughtfulness, sacrifice, discipline, and determination of citizens of the United States that obtained our right to vote. Historically, inventions, musical innovations, and many more accomplishments and contributions developed by descendants of enslaved Africans in America have been misappropriated. We learn about presidents, battles, and dates. The impression too often perpetuated in history books and in popular culture is that you have to be a president, someone special, or white to have an important idea or to achieve major accomplishments. This is an idea that disempowers citizens and should not be propagated further. Like Nash, Howard's experience in the civil rights movement gave him a different understanding of how history is made. It's an understanding that informs every page of this book. When A People's History of the United States first came out, Ronald Reagan was on his path to becoming the president. Culturally, the country was moving noticeably rightward. Movements that sought to roll back the gains of the civil rights movement, women's liberation movement, and other progressive changes of the 1960s and 1970s were gaining ground. Unions came under a sustained attack from which they have never recovered. In such an environment, this book could have been lost, published into obscurity. why it wasn't is worth considering. First of all, as with any publishing effort, there was some luck involved. The New York Times Book Review could have decided the book didn't merit a review, as it so often does with books written from the standpoint of the left. Having decided to review it, the editors at the Times could have easily sent the book to be trashed by a figure of the newly aggressive right, as it so often does. Instead, they asked the highly regarded historian Eric Foner to review A People's History of the United States. And while not without criticisms of the book, Foner gave it an extremely positive notice. His words from the March 2nd, 1980 New York Times Book Review are worth considering. The 1970s witnessed an unprecedented redefinition of historical studies, a byproduct of the ferment of the 1960s, in which the distinctive experiences of black people, women, and indigenous people, workers, and other neglected groups moved to the forefront of inquiry. Howard Zinn is the first historian to attempt to survey all of American history from the perspective of the new scholarship. A distinguished scholar and the author of 9 previous books, Howard Zinn is also a veteran of the civil rights and anti-war movements, and is currently an embattled defender of academic freedom at Boston University. Make sure this thing stay plugged up over there. He is refreshingly candid in announcing his purpose. Too much history, he contends, is written from the viewpoint of governments, conquerors, diplomats, and leaders. His people's history, by way of contrast, sides with the looters, the downtrodden, the underdog. It is a book disrespectful of governments and respectful of people's movements of resistance. Professor Zinn writes with an enthusiasm rarely encountered in the prose of academic history, and his text is studded with telling quotations from labor leaders, war resistors, and fugitive slaves. There are vivid descriptions of events that are usually ignored. However, Foner felt the book's salutary emphasis on the enormous capacity of apparently helpless people to resist is tempered by an underlying frustration at the meager results produced by this history of resistance. He continues. The stirring protests, strikes, and rebellions never appeared to accomplish anything. Uprisings are either crushed, deflected, or co-opted. Apparent victories, such as the emancipation of slaves, simply serve the interests of businessmen. Incremental gains, such as those of the 1930s, merely stabilize the system. Why such movements often fail to achieve their goals is never adequately explained. Foner's view that the book reflects a deeply pessimistic vision of the American experience was, in the end, not shared by many other readers, who saw in the book a more affirmative, in fact, inspirational story. Indeed, Howard is someone who consistently looked for the unrealized possibilities of history. One of the reasons this book has been considered so dangerous by so many figures of the establishment, whether in the academy or the halls of power. Howard was interested in historical potential, the what might have been, the unrealized visions, the expanded horizon of protest, as much as he was in detailing forms of oppression. And a careful reading of this book will reveal, I believe, a deep appreciation of the human capacity to resist oppression, to collectively make history, and to achieve ends those undertaking their protest. My fault, hold on. Dang, I lost my place. Okay, hold on. Dang, it really did. Okay, hold on. Where were we? Okay, we're gonna start back here. And a careful reading of this book will reveal, I believe, a deep appreciation of the human capacity to resist oppression, to collectively make history, to achieve ends those undertaking their protests perhaps never imagined possible, and often did not live to see realized in their lifetime, even while recognizing that such gains can prove fragile and can never be taken for granted. For Howard, also, there was a joy in the effort itself. He had an appreciation of the bonds of solidarity, mutual affection, and creative expression that the participation in social movements produced. The idea that people make history and can alter its course, that institutions have human origin and can be changed by humans, is truly subversive. And it is a central reason this book has drawn the ire of so many censors and would-be censors. As Howard wrote at the end of his play, Marx in Soho, remember, to be radical is simply to grasp the root of the problem, and the root is us. Among the first champions of a people's history of the United States were the thousands of students who had been a part of Howard's classes at Spelman College and Boston University, and many others who heard him speak on their college campuses and at anti-war rallies, and ordered it immediately for themselves, and in some cases for courses they were teaching. The movements of the 1960s and the early 1970s had also nurtured a new generation of receptive readers, many of whom were moving into roles as educators in high school and on college campuses. Howard's classes were so popular that Boston University sought to limit participation in them. Howard famously battled with the neoconservative president of the university, John Silber, coming close to losing his job on a few occasions. But in the end, he came out on top. Comically, one university administrator responded to his appeal for more teaching assistants for his huge introductory class by saying Howard could have more TAs if he agreed to decrease the class size. Instead, Howard enlisted student volunteers who would take his class 1 year for credit and then return the next year to lead sections. In a matter of weeks after the release of A People's History, HarperCollins found, unexpectedly, that it had sold out of the first hardcover edition. Then an interesting turn of history occurred. Howard's editor, Hugh Van Dusen, went to the hardcover division sales manager to push for a quick reprint and was rebuffed. The previous projections for the book were inauspicious. Perhaps there would be returns. A paperback would eventually come into a future catalog, but Van Dusen fought for an accelerated paperback release so much earlier than planned. The book was available in an affordable, popular way. The book continued to catch on and became, as no one predicted, a cultural touchstone and publishing phenomenon. A book that each year sold more copies than the year before, the opposite of the traditional trajectory. As of 2015, A People's History of the United States has sold more than 2.6 million in North America and have been translated into more than 20 languages. Rarely does a month pass that I don't see someone engrossed in the book at the New York City subway station. That's interesting. This new movie came out. I was going back and reading I was going back and watching The Sopranos. Oh wow, that's here. Wow. Okay, that's in this book. I didn't know it was in this book. That's nuts. That's crazy. Okay. One of the readers of those early copies of A People's History was a young Matt Damon, whose mother, Nancy Carlson Page, was a friend and movement ally of Howard's in Boston. Matt would famously go on to write with Ben Affleck a scene in the Oscar-winning film Good Will Hunting, in which the self-educated working-class math genius he plays calls A People's History a book that will knock you on your ass. That moment opened up new audiences for Howard in his work and his ideas. And A People's History entered into popular culture. Another reader was a cartoonist. Is it Matt Groening? Cartoonist Matt Groening, who drew a copy of the book into an episode of the television series The Simpsons. Later, HBO's acclaimed series The Sopranos constructed a storyline around Howard's critical view of Christopher Columbus. The episode opens with a close-up of Anthony Soprano Jr. reading a hardcover edition of the book. It was nuts. It was nice to see. But it is really due to the many teachers heroically trying to encourage critical thinking among their students that this book continues to find new readers. This is not without its risk in the area of high-stakes testing and scapegoating teachers. While seeking to dismantle their unions and impose patriotic views of history. In 2014 in Colorado, students and teachers, some holding signs quoting Howard, walked out in protest when a local school board sought to ensure its advanced placement history course AP history courses promote citizenship, patriotism, essential and benefits of the free market system, respect for authority, and respect for individual rights, and that they did not encourage or condone civil disorder, social strife, or disregard of the law. An interesting challenge if you want to teach, for example, the American Revolution or the history of abolitionism. In Oklahoma, in February 2015, members of the Common Education Committee voted to ban all AP history courses because they focus on what is bad about America. That is crazy. That is crazy. They banned teaching what is bad about America. That is crazy. In the state where I grew up, Indiana, then Governor Mitch Daniels, who is now the president of Purdue University, sent emails just days after Howard's death in January 2010, openly celebrating his passing and seeking to ensure that no Indiana teachers were using a people's history. That is sick. This terrible anti-American academic finally passed away. Oh, I did not think that's how they'd. I did not think that's what I would read. Dang. The obits and commentaries mentioned that his book, A People's History of the United States, is a textbook of choice in high schools and colleges around the country. An Okay. It is truly excruciable, anti-factual piece of disinformation that misstates American history on every page. Can someone assure me that it is not in use anywhere in Indiana? If it is, how do we get rid of it before any more young people are force-fed a total false version of our history? It is clear why Daniels and his allies felt threatened by Howard's approach to history and his politics, and why someone who is seeking to dismantle president unions would not have wanted people studying the vital role they have played in protecting the rights of working people or other examples of popular struggles challenging authority. Despite these attacks, and even at the risk of losing one's job, people have continued to assign Howard's book alongside the assigned textbook, share their personal copies, photocopy sections for students, and read aloud passages of a people's history. In addition to drawing on the book, growing numbers of teachers across the United States use curricula and resources from organizations such as Voices of a People's History of the United States, the Zinn Education Project, Rethinking Schools, and Teaching for Change to bring a people's history to life in the classroom. None of this is to say that Howard does not have more serious critics, including those on the left. Howard had no issue with that. In encouraging critical thinking, he hoped people would apply the same independent mindset to his own views. That is why he opens A People's History of the United States by stating his point of view very directly. In the inevitable taking of sides, which come from selection and emphasis in history, I prefer to tell the story of the. My fault. Let me start this quote over. In the inevitable taking of sides, which comes from selection and emphasis in history, I prefer to try to tell the story of the discovery of America from the viewpoint of the Iroquois, of the Constitution from the standpoint of the slaves, of Andrew Jackson as seen by the Cherokees, of the Civil War as seen by the New York Irish, of the Mexican War as seen by the deserting soldiers of Scott's army, of the rise of industrialism as seen by the young women and Lowell textile mills. And Lowell textile mills. Of the Spanish-American War as seen by the Cubans. The conquest of the Philippines as seen by the black soldiers on Luzon. The Gilded Age as seen by the southern farmers. The First World War as seen by the socialists. The Second World War as seen by the pacifists. The New Deal as seen by African Americans in Harlem. The post-war American Empire as seen by peons in Latin America, and so on, to the limited extent that any one person, however he or she strains, can see history from the standpoint of the others. Howard believed in laying his cards on the table. He did not hide behind the historian's easily available stance of distance, expert objectivity. He had a viewpoint and was happy to be challenged and engage in dialogue about it. There are some readers who wish he included footnotes in this volume. Howard felt that missed the point of the book, which was to read an accessible and popular history. He wanted to welcome his readers, not intimidate them or scare them off, especially in a book that at more than 600 pages is already daunting to embark on for the first time. Other historians found fault with Howard's departure from the narrow confines of academia. Howard was more comfortable on the picket line than at a session of the Organization of American Historians, he'd be the first to admit. More to the point, some readers have longed for more women's voices. Some have taken issue with his emphasis on spontaneity in history. My own feeling is that Howard's predictions in chapter 24 about the coming revolt of the guards, the intellectuals, the homeowners, the taxpayers, the skilled workers, the professionals, the servant of governments, who make up the so-called middle class, was overly optimistic, as he himself later acknowledged. Yet at the same time, he was remarkably persistent. He is remarkably prescient in writing about what he calls the 99% versus the 1%, years before the Occupy movement popularized these terms. Interestingly, others claim credit for the slogan or were given credit for it, ignoring Howard's much earlier use of the term in this book. But such optimism was vital to Howard's politics and personality. It is what led him to undertake so ambitious a project as a people's history of the United States in the first place, an outcome that he frequently said he never would have been possible without the encouragement of his wife, Rosalind Zinn. It is what brought him and his family to teach at Spelman College and become, unexpectedly, participants in the civil rights movement. It is what led him to write 3 plays, Emma, Daughter of Venus, and Marx in Soho. In addition to his many other important works of history, fundamentally, Howard had a confidence in people's ability to work together and change their circumstances. In a recent essay, the science fiction writer Ursula K. Le Guin speaks of the honest, uncompromising search for a realistic hope and a chance to transcend the paralyzing hierarchies of gender, race, class, nation, a chance to find a radical cure for the radical evil of our social system. Howard believed in taking that chance and holding out that hope, but he did so because he was grounded in all the examples from our past: the abolitionist movement, the women's suffrage movement, the struggle for the right to organize unions and to work an 8-hour day. When people proved that causes that at one point seemed unrealistic and hopeless proved otherwise, and in doing so provided what the Welsh socialist and cultural theorist Raymond Williams called resources of hope. In a way, the successes of A People's History of the United States is an embodiment of Howard's wager on optimism. A People's History provided sustenance to a progressive countercurrent that developed from the early 1980s and grew as teachers, organizers, and the next generation of students developed new political initiatives and movements. Howard dedicated our book, Voices of a People's History of the United States, to the rebel voices of the oncoming generation. Okay. At every step of that journey, Howard was there to fight alongside them. Throughout, in his many lectures, interviews, and speeches to anti-war protests, from the smallest of gatherings to rallies of tens of thousands, he reminded us to the history of social change in this country, and kept coming back to his core ideas. That change comes from below. That progress comes only from the people resisting and organizing. Workers going on strike, consumers boycotting, soldiers refusing to fight, saying no to injustice and war. That we cannot rely on elected officials or leaders, but instead have to rely on our individual and collective actions. That change never happens in a straight line, but always has ups and downs, twists and turns, and that there are no guarantees in history. But Howard added a distinctive element to these arguments by embodying the understanding that the shared experiences of working alongside others for political change is the most rewarding, fulfilling, and meaningful life one can live. The sense of solidarity he had with other people in struggle, the sense of joy he had in life, was infectious. He communicated to everyone around him that they mattered, that they were in an active part of making history. In an article of the labor organizer of the socialist Eugene Debs that Howard wrote in the 1990s, he said, "We are always in need of radicals who are also lovable," adding that we need to learn from Debs a determination to hold up before a troubled public those ideas that are both bold and inviting. The more bold, the more inviting. When the actor David Strathairn read those lines at a celebration of Howard's life and work in California soon after his passing, it was clear to all of us in the audience that those words described Howard as much as they did Debs. Howard's ideas were bold, inviting, and inspiring. Okay, we're going to be done with the introduction. Chapter 1. Columbus. Columbus, the Indians, and human progress. Again, if I mispronounce any of these names, excuse me, if I mispronounce any of these names, feel free to comment the correct pronunciation or anything like that. Arab men and women, naked, tawny, and full of wonder, emerged from their villages onto the island's beach and swam out to get a closer look at the strange big boat. When Columbus and his sailors came to a shore, carrying swords, speaking oddly, the Arabs ran to greet them, brought them food, water, and gifts. He later wrote of this in his log. This is Columbus that we're talking about. And why not do this? Why not play this game? If something that come up during this book that wasn't taught to you in high school, leave a comment. If something is read in this book that you don't think or you know for a fact isn't being taught to your kids in school, leave some type of comment. Because this is important. This is history that we're talking about. If this history isn't being taught, what history is being taught? What is being taught in the schools? Because there are things in this book, factual things in this book, that were never taught to me in whether that was going through grade school, middle school, going through a high school. It was never taught to me in any type of form. And it's important things. It's not like you just leaving out things like, the weather was bad in July. No, you leaving out the context of these wars, how the people actually felt about these wars, not how the politicians, how the presidents felt about these things. Okay, so this is from Columbus's log. They brought us parrots and balls of cotton and spears and many other things, which they exchanged for glass beads and hawksbills. They willingly traded everything they owned. They were well built, with good bodies and handsome features. They do not bear arms and do not know them. For I showed them a sword, they took it by the edge and cut themselves out of ignorance. They have no iron. Their spears are made of cane. They would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want. Already, right there alone, do not celebrate Columbus Day. Already there, in that paragraph alone, these are from Columbus's log. Already in that paragraph alone is not no reason to celebrate Columbus Day at all, in any form. These Arabs of the Bahama Islands were much like Indians on the mainland, who were remarkable. European observers were to say again and again, for the hospitality and their belief in sharing. These traits did not stand out in the Europe of the Renaissance, dominated as it was by the religion of popes, the government of kings, the frenzy for money that marked Western civilization, and its first messenger for the Americas, Christopher Columbus. Columbus wrote, "As soon as I arrived in the Indies, on the first island which I found, I took some of the natives by force, in order that they might learn and might give me information of whatever there is in these parts." Columbus is celebrated in school. celebrated all through my entire schooling. The information that Columbus wanted most was, where is the gold? He had persuaded the king and queen of Spain to finance an expedition to the lands. The wealth he expected would be on the other side of the Atlantic, the Indies and Asia, gold and spices. For like other informed people of his time, he knew the earth was round, and he could sail west in order to get to the Far East. Spain was recently unified, one of the new modern nation states like France, England, and Portugal. Its population, mostly poor peasants, worked for nobility, who were 2% of the population and owned 95% of the land. Spain had tied itself to the Catholic Church, expelled all the Jews, driven out the Moors. Like other states of the new modern world, Spain sought gold, which was becoming the new mark of wealth, more useful than land because it could buy anything. There was gold in Asia, it was thought, and certainly silks and spices, for Marco Polo and others had brought back marvelous things from their overland expeditions centuries before. Now that the Turks had conquered Constantinople and the eastern Mediterranean and controlled the land routes to Asia, a sea route was needed. Portuguese sailors were working their way around the southern tip of Africa. Spain decided to gamble on a long sail across an unknown ocean, unknown to Europeans. In return for bringing back gold and spices, they promised Columbus 10% of the profits, governorship over newfound lands, and the fame that would go with a new title, Admiral of the Ocean Sea. He was a merchant's clerk from the Italian city of Genoa, part-time weaver, the son of a skilled weaver, an expert sailor. He set out with 3 sailing ships, the largest of which was the Santa Maria, perhaps 100 feet long and 39 crew members. Columbus would never have made it to Asia, which was thousands of miles further than he had calculated. Imagining a smaller world, he would have been doomed by that great expanse as sea. But he was lucky. 1/4 of the way there, he came upon an unknown, uncharted land that lay between Europe and Asia, the Americas. It was early October 1492, and 33 days since he and his crew had left the Canary Islands off the Atlantic coast of Africa. Now they saw branches and sticks floating in the water. They saw flocks of birds. These were signs of land. Then, on October 12th, a sailor called Rodrigo saw the early morning moon shining on white sand and cried out. It was an island in the Bahamas, the Caribbean Sea. Caribbean, either way. The first man to sight land was supposed to get a yearly pension of 100. A yearly pension of 10,000 maravedis. I don't know how to say that. For life. But Rodrigo never got it. Columbus claimed he had seen a light the evening before. He got the reward. So, approaching land, They were met by the Arab Indians, who swam out to greet them. They lived in village communes, had developed agriculture of corn, yams, and cassava. They would spin and weave, but they had no horses or work animals. They had no iron, but they wore tiny gold ornaments in their ears. This was to have enormous consequences. It led Columbus to take some of them aboard ship as prisoners, because he insisted that they guide him to the source of gold. He then sailed to what is now Cuba, then to Hispaniola, the island which today consists of Haiti and the Dominican Republic. There, bits of visible gold in the rivers and a gold mask presented to Columbus by a local Indian chief led to wild visions of gold fields. On Hispaniola, out of timber from the Santa Maria, which had run aground, Columbus built the fort, the first European military base in the Western Hemisphere. He called it Navidad, Christmas, and left 39 crew members there, with instructions to find and store the gold. He took more Indian prisoners and put them aboard his two remaining ships. At one part of the island, he got into a fight with Indians who refused to trade as many bows and arrows as he and his men wanted. Two were run through with swords and bled to death. Then, the Nina and the Pinta set sail for the Azores and Spain. When the weather turned cold, the Indian prisoners began to die. Columbus' report to the court in Madrid was extravagant. He insisted that he had reached Asia. It was Cuba. And the island off the coast of China, Hispaniola. His descriptions were part fact, part fiction. It is a miracle. Mountains and hills, plains and pastures are both fertile and beautiful. The harbors are unbelievably good, and there are many wide rivers, of which the majority contain gold. There are many spices and great mines of gold and other metals. The Indians, Columbus reported, are so naive and are so free with their possessions that no one... The Indians, Columbus reported, are so naive and so free with their possessions that no one who has not witnessed them would believe it. When you ask for something they have, they never say no. To the contrary, they offer to share with anyone. He concluded his report by asking for a little help from their majesties, and in return he would bring them, from his next voyage, as much gold as they need, and as many slaves as they asked. He was full of religious talk. Thus the eternal God, our Lord, gives victory to those who follow his way over apparent impossibilities. Because of Columbus's exaggerated report and promises, his second expedition was giving 17 ships, and more than 1,200 men. The aim was clear: slaves and gold. See, I bet you, if you was to teach the kids this, what their reaction be when you try to celebrate what Columbus Day truly represents. Columbus Day truly represents slaves and gold. And nobody would want to celebrate that if they truly knew what they meant. They went from island to island in the Caribbean, taking Indians as captives. But as word spread of the Europeans' intent, they found more and more empty villages. On Haiti, they found that sailors left behind at Fort Navidad had been killed in a battle with the Indians after they had roamed the island in gangs, looking for gold, taking women and children as slaves for sex and labor. Now, from his base on Haiti, Columbus spent expedition after expedition into the interior. They found no gold fields, but had to fill up the ships returning to Spain with some kind of dividend. In the year 1495, they went on a great slave raid. It feel crazy to call it a great slave raid. Rounded up 1,500 Arabs, men, women, and children. Put them in pens guarded by Spaniards and dogs. Then picked the 500 best specimen to load onto the ships. Of those 500, 200 died en route. The rest arrived alive in Spain and were put up for sale by the archdeacon of the town, who reported that, although the slaves were naked as the day they were born, they showed no more embarrassment than animals. Columbus later wrote, "Let us in the name of the Holy Trinity go on sending all the slaves that can be sold." But too many of the slaves died in captivity, and so Columbus, desperate to pay back dividends to those who had invested, had to make good his promise to fill the ship with gold. In the province of Chiaco on Haiti, where he and his men imagined huge gold fields to exist, they ordered all persons 14 years or older to collect a certain quantity of gold every 3 months. When they brought it in, they were given copper tokens to hang around their neck. Indians found without a copper token had their hands cut off and bled to death. Jesus fucking Christ. This is really graphic and really, but it's history is bloody. You can't tell history without, can't tell a true version of history without talking about the bloodshed. The Indians had been given an impossible task. Their only gold around was bits of dust garnered from the streams. So they fled, were hunted down with dogs, and were killed. Trying to put together an army of resistance, the Arabs faced Spaniards who had armor, muskets, swords, and horses. When the Spaniards took prisoners, they hanged them or burned them to death. Among the Arabs, mass suicides began, and Cassavana poison. Infants were killed to save them from the Spaniards. In 2 years, through murder, mutilation, or suicide, half of the 250,000 Indians on Haiti were dead. Holy shit. Even though I had some of the more graphic points or some of the number points is still striking to me. When it became clear that there was no gold left, the Indians were taken as slave labor on huge estates known as encomiendas. They were worked at a ferocious pace and died by the thousands. By the year 1515, there were perhaps 50,000 Indians left. Holy shit. By 1550, there were 500. Wow. 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 A report of the year 1650 shows none of the original Erics or their descendants lived on the island. The chief source, and on many matters the only source of information about what happened on the island after Columbus came, is Bartolomé de las Casas, who as a young priest participated in the conquest of Cuba. For a time, he owned a plantation on which Indian slaves worked, but he gave that up and became a vehement critic of Spanish cruelty. Las Casas transcribed Columbus's journal, and in his 50s began a multi-volume history of the Indies. In it, he describes the Indians. They are agile, he says, and can swim long distances, especially the women. They are not completely peaceful because they do battle from time to time with other tribes, but the casualties seem small, and they fight when they are individually moved to do so, because of some grievance, not on the order of captains or kings. Okay. We're going to stop right there. We're going to stop right there for the night. Pick back up, probably sometime in the afternoon. Saturday again. Share this live. Subscribe to the newsletter. Subscribe to the podcast. Subscribe. Share this video. Follow us on all social medias: Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Obviously, you're watching this on Facebook. Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. We on TikTok. I'm 30 Alliance. My 30th Alliance. We outside.